The Galactic Combat Academy floated in the void like a monument to organized violence. Its gleaming spires and training complexes designed by species who took their warfare very seriously indeed, which, considering the galaxy's track record of solving disputes through creative applications of energy weapons and orbital bombardments, was probably wise planning on someone's part. The Academy had been established roughly 300 standard years ago, after the Fourth Galactic War had demonstrated that randomly shooting at each other without proper technique was embarrassingly inefficient. Now, representatives from 47 different species came here to learn the fine art of professionally dismantling their enemies, complete with certification programs and standardized testing procedures. Because apparently even interstellar violence needed proper documentation. The hierarchical system was beautifully simple, if you enjoyed watching natural selection play out in real time. At the top sat the Korthak, 8 feet of armored death with mandibles that could snap reinforced titanium and a cultural obsession with honorable combat that made ancient warrior societies look like meditation retreats. They typically graduated with marks that made other species question their life choices. Below them came the Vextar, whose forearms and natural proficiency with energy weapons had made them the galaxy's go-to mercenaries for the past 2 centuries. They approached combat with the methodical precision of accountants, except their spreadsheets involved casualty estimates and ammunition expenditure rates. The middle tiers housed various species with their own specialized talents. The crystalline Zephyrians, who could interface directly with weapons systems, the insectoid Hive Collective with their natural swarm tactics, and the reptilian Draknar, whose scales could deflect most small arms fire. Each species had carved out their particular niche in the grand ecosystem of organized mayhem. And then, at the very bottom, sat humanity. Humans had joined the galactic community only 50 years ago, stumbling onto the interstellar stage with all the grace of a drunk relative at a wedding. They were small by galactic standards, possessed no natural armor, lacked redundant organs, and their reaction time was considered leisurely by most species standards. Their inclusion in the Combat Academy was generally viewed as a courtesy, like allowing the neighbor's enthusiastic but clumsy child to join the neighborhood sports league. The current human representative sat in the back corner of combat theory classroom, appearing to pay attention to Instructor Gavatok's lecture on advanced tactical formations in zero-G environment. She was particularly unremarkable, even by human standards, barely reaching 5.5 feet, with brown hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail, and the kind of build that suggested she'd never won an arm wrestling contest in her life. Her classmates had long since dismissed her as another participant in the Academy's diversity initiative. The 3 Korthak students occasionally glanced her way with what might charitably be called benevolent indifference, the way one might regard a house pet that had learned to walk upright. The Vextar had calculated her threat assessment within the first week and filed her under negligible factors. Instructor Gavatok himself was a prime specimen of Korthak military tradition. His service record included 2 successful planetary campaigns, 47 successful single combats, and a decoration for creative application of overwhelming force that had become legendary throughout the Academy. His mandibles bore ceremonial scarring that indicated his rank within the warrior caste, and his posture suggested he could probably bench press a hover tank without breaking his concentration. He had been teaching at the Academy for 12 years, during which time he had produced some of the galaxy's most competent military officers. His methods were time-tested: identify each student's natural strengths, push them to their absolute limits, then push them slightly beyond those limits, until they either broke through to new capabilities, or broke entirely. The Academy's medical bay had become quite efficient at treating the latter category. The morning's lesson focused on multi-axis engagement scenarios, the kind of tactical nightmare that occurred when enemy forces attacked from directions that didn't exist in most species' traditional concepts of up and down. Gavatok's deep, resonant voice filled the classroom as he gestured at holographic displays, showing formation patterns that looked like 3-dimensional spider webs, having an argument with geometry. In zero-gravity environments, he intoned, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience, traditional ground-based tactics become not merely useless, but actively detrimental to unit cohesion and survival probability. The holographic display shifted to show a simulated battle, where one side had apparently forgotten this lesson and was currently being systematically dismantled by opponents, who had embraced the three-dimensional nature of space combat. It was educational in the way that watching a traffic accident was educational. You learned what not to do, assuming you survived the learning experience. The key principle, Galactic continued, his four eyes scanning the classroom with the intensity of someone who had personally participated in too many of these scenarios, is maintaining situational awareness across all possible approach vectors, while coordinating fire support and movement patterns, in an environment where cover is a temporary concept at best. Several students were taking notes with the desperate intensity of individuals who understood that failing to grasp these concepts might have consequences beyond poor grades. The Korthak students, naturally, absorbed the information with the calm confidence of apex predators, learning new hunting techniques. The Vextar cross-referenced everything with their personal combat databases, their cybernetic implants flickering as they processed tactical algorithms. The human in the back corner continued to appear attentive, though her expression suggested she might be thinking about lunch, or possibly wondering why everyone else was making such detailed notes about concepts that seemed relatively straightforward. It was hard to tell, really, since humans had developed facial expressions that could mean virtually anything, a trait that made them diplomatically useful but tactically unpredictable. Tomorrow, Galactic announced as the session wound down, we will begin practical application exercises in the combat simulation chambers. Each student will be assigned scenarios appropriate to their skill level and species capability. The way he said it suggested that some students would be facing scenarios designed to push the boundaries of what was considered survivable, while others would be gently introduced to concepts like which end of the weapon points toward the enemy. The human, based on her placement in the Academy's informal hierarchy, would likely fall into the latter category. After all, there was no point in subjecting a species to challenges they clearly weren't equipped to handle. That would be unnecessarily cruel, and the Academy prided itself on its humanitarian approach to military education. The irony of that particular assumption would become apparent soon enough. The combat simulation chamber hummed with the kind of energy that suggested expensive technology was about to be used for its intended purpose, which in this case involved creating elaborate scenarios where students could practice not dying in creative ways. The chamber itself was a marvel of engineering, a spherical room lined with hollow projectors, gravity manipulators, and enough processing power to simulate entire battlefields down to the molecular level of individual weapons discharge. Galactic stood at the control console like a conductor preparing to orchestrate a symphony of controlled violence. His mandibles clicked in what passed for satisfaction among his species as he reviewed the day's assignment. Each scenario had been carefully calibrated to challenge students appropriately, a concept that in military education usually translated to make them suffer just enough to learn something useful. The first group consisted of 3 Korthak students, who approached the chamber with the casual confidence of apex predators entering their natural habitat. Their scenario involved a full-scale planetary assault simulation, complete with orbital bombardment, atmospheric fighters, and the kind of ground combat that would make military historians weep with professional appreciation. They entered the chamber discussing tactical modifications to standard assault protocols, because apparently even simulated warfare was an opportunity for creative improvement. The watching students gathered around the observation screens with the enthusiasm of spectators at a particularly violent sporting event. The Korthak students immediately began demonstrating why their species had conquered 17 different star systems before deciding that military conquest was less profitable than military consulting. They moved through the simulation like lethal poetry, coordinating attacks with the kind of seamless precision that made it look deceptively easy. "Textbook execution," murmured one of the Vextar students, their cybernetic implants recording every tactical decision for later analysis. Standard Korthak assault doctrine, modified for the gravitational anomalies in Sector 7. The simulation concluded with the kind of decisive victory that would have made their ancestors proud and their enemies extinct. Galactic nodded approvingly as the Korthak students emerged from the chamber, their breathing slightly elevated but their confidence intact. They had performed exactly as expected, which in the context of military education was both reassuring and utterly predictable. The Vextar students followed with a scenario that resembled a three-dimensional chess match played with high-energy weapons and mathematical precision. Their forearms allowed them to operate multiple weapon systems simultaneously, while their enhanced neural processing calculated trajectories, enemy movement patterns, and ammunition expenditure rates in real time. They approached combat the way accountants approached tax season, with methodical efficiency and a deep appreciation for properly organized. Their simulation involved a complex multi-front engagement, where they systematically dismantled enemy positions through superior positioning and overwhelming firepower coordination. It was less poetry and more technical manual, but equally effective in its own way. They emerged from the chamber with the satisfied air of individuals who had successfully balanced a particularly challenging equation. Efficient resource utilization, observed Gavitok, making notes on his evaluation pad. Minimal ammunition waste, optimal positioning protocol, standard Vexstar methodology. The pattern continued through the morning as each species demonstrated their particular approach to organized violence. The crystalline Zephyrians interfaced directly with weapons systems, turning the simulation chamber into an extension of their consciousness. The Hive Collective students moved as a single organism, their individual actions coordinated through biological communication networks that made verbal commands obsolete. Each group faced scenarios designed to challenge their capabilities, while remaining within reasonable parameters of what they could be expected to handle. The Academy had long ago learned that pushing students too far beyond their natural limitations resulted in expensive equipment damage and uncomfortable conversations with insurance investigators. Finally, Gavitok's attention turned to the human student who had been waiting patiently at the back of the group. She stood with the kind of relaxed posture that suggested either complete confidence or complete resignation. It was difficult to determine which, since humans had evolved facial expressions that could apparently mean anything depending on context. Basic urban combat scenario, Gavitok announced, his tone carrying the gentle patience of someone addressing a particularly slow student. Single opponent engagement, limited environmental hazards, duration 15 minutes maximum. The other students exchanged glances that ranged from sympathetic to bemused. A basic urban combat scenario was typically assigned to students in their first week, designed to introduce fundamental concepts like cover and ammunition conservation, without the risk of psychological trauma or expensive equipment replacement. Instructor called out one of the Korthak students with what might have been genuine concern. Perhaps a non-combat scenario would be more appropriate. Tactical analysis or logistics coordination. The suggestion carried the kind of well-intentioned condescension that made everyone involved feel better about the obvious mismatch between student capabilities and academic requirements. After all, there was no shame in acknowledging natural limitations. The galaxy was full of species who contributed to galactic civilization without necessarily excelling at personal combat. The Academy requires all students to complete basic combat certifications. Gavitok replied, though his tone suggested he appreciated the concern. Standard protocol will be followed. Several students had begun placing informal wagers on the outcome, though the betting was less about whether the human would succeed and more about how quickly the simulation would end. The odds favored rapid conclusion, with the over-under set at approximately 3 minutes of actual engagement time. Credits on 2 minutes, whispered one Vexstar student to another. Standard human reaction times, minimal tactical awareness, straightforward conclusion. The human student seemed entirely unaware of the speculations surrounding her impending performance. She approached the simulation chamber with the same unremarkable demeanor she had maintained throughout her time at the Academy, neither particularly eager nor obviously reluctant, just present and apparently prepared to participate in whatever educational experience awaited. Remember, Gavitok called out as she reached the chamber entrance, this is a learning exercise. There is no expectation of exceptional performance. Simply engage with the scenario to the best of your natural capability. The way he phrased it suggested that her natural capabilities were generally understood to be limited, which was probably meant to be reassuring but came across as the kind of diplomatic encouragement, usually reserved for small children, attempting tasks beyond their developmental stage. The human nodded and stepped into the chamber, disappearing behind the sealed entrance as the simulation systems powered up. The observation screens flickered to life, showing a holographic urban environment complete with damaged buildings, scattered debris, and the kind of tactical complexity that made military planners wake up in cold sweats. Standard difficulty rating, inquired one of the observing students. Level 2, Gavitok replied, which was essentially the Academy's way of saying tutorial mode with safety protocols. Single opponent,
Basic AI behavioral patterns, minimal environmental complexity. The simulation began, and the human appeared on screen in what looked like a war-torn city block. Her opponent materialized across the street, a holographic construct designed to provide basic combat challenge without overwhelming newer students. The AI was programmed with standard tactical responses and enough artificial intelligence to make the engagement educational without being traumatic. What happened next would require several formal reports, 3 separate insurance investigations, and a complete revision of the Academy's assessment protocols for human students. But that was still a few minutes away, and for now, everyone settled in to watch what they assumed would be a brief and predictable demonstration of species-appropriate educational content.
The first hint that something was amiss came approximately 30 seconds into the simulation, when the human did something that made several observers question whether the holo projectors were malfunctioning. Instead of taking cover behind the conveniently placed barriers that were clearly marked as tactical positions for educational purposes, she disappeared. Not in the dramatic special effects way that indicated teleportation technology or advanced camouflage systems. She simply wasn't where she had been a moment before, and the observation cameras were having difficulty determining where she had gone. This was problematic, since the simulation chamber was a sealed environment approximately 50 meters in diameter, and humans weren't generally known for their ability to dematerialize at will. "Sensor malfunction?" inquired one of the Vexstar students, their cybernetic implants automatically running diagnostics on the observation equipment. Gavantok frowned at his control console, where multiple tracking systems were reporting conflicting data. The chamber's sensors could detect the presence of one human life sign, but were frustratingly vague about providing specific coordinates. It was as if she was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, which was either a profound philosophical statement or a significant technical problem. "All systems functioning within normal parameters," he muttered, his mandibles clicking in a way that suggested growing concern mixed with professional puzzlement. On screen, the AI opponent was demonstrating the kind of confusion that occurred when artificial intelligence encountered scenarios outside its programming parameters. It had been designed to engage in straightforward urban combat with an opponent who would behave according to standard tactical doctrine. Instead, it was standing in an empty street, rotating its sensors in increasingly frantic patterns while searching for a target that seemed to have violated several basic laws of physics. The human reappeared behind the AI construct with the sudden materialization of someone who had spent considerable time learning how to move without being noticed. Her approach had involved a route that apparently included sewers, building interiors, and what appeared to be a brief excursion across several rooftops that the simulation's architects had assumed were purely decorative. The AI construct registered her presence approximately half a second before she applied what military instructors technically classified as aggressive problem-solving techniques to its central processing unit. The holographic opponent ceased to function in a manner that suggested its warranty had been thoroughly voided. "Simulation complete," announced the computer system with the cheerful efficiency of artificial intelligence that wasn't programmed to recognize when something had gone seriously wrong. The observation deck fell silent with the kind of quiet that typically preceded either spontaneous applause or emergency evacuation procedure. Gavantok stared at his control console as if it might provide an explanation for what had just occurred, while his students exchanged glances that ranged from confused to deeply concerned. 15-second engagement duration, observed one of the Vexstar students in the tone of someone reporting data that their cognitive systems were refusing to process properly. "Single action resolution, perhaps," suggested a Korthak student with the kind of diplomatic caution that indicated his warrior instincts were actively arguing with his rational mind. The simulation parameters were incorrectly calibrated. Gavantok was already adjusting settings on his control panel, his movements carrying the determined efficiency of someone who had encountered an anomaly and intended to understand it through systematic investigation. The next scenario loaded with a difficulty rating that jumped several levels, featuring multiple opponents, complex environmental hazards, and the kind of tactical challenges that typically required team coordination to resolve successfully. "Advanced urban warfare simulation," he announced, his voice carrying a note of professional curiosity that his students recognized as potentially dangerous. "Multiple hostiles, dynamic environment, full combat parameter. The human accepted this escalation with the same unremarkable demeanor she had maintained throughout her academy enrollment. She entered the simulation chamber, as if advanced urban warfare was merely another item on a routine to-do list, somewhere between attend lectures and complete homework assignment. The new scenario materialized around her with the kind of complexity that made military strategists spend years developing countermeasures. Enemy positions were strategically distributed across multiple levels of a damaged urban environment, with overlapping fields of fire and tactical advantages that would challenge even experienced combat teams. The AI opponents were programmed with advanced behavioral algorithms and equipped with weapons systems that could pose genuine threats to careless students. What followed was a masterclass in applied violence that would have impressed military historians and terrified insurance actuaries in equal measure. The human moved through the simulation environment like liquid death, flowing around obstacles and through defensive positions with a fluidity that suggested the laws of physics were more like friendly suggestions than immutable constraint. She utilized improvised weapons with the creativity of someone who had apparently spent considerable time thinking about the offensive potential of everyday objects. A piece of rubble became a precision projectile. A damaged vehicle transformed into mobile cover. The simulation's carefully designed defensive positions were systematically turned into tactical advantages through methods that weren't covered in any standard military manual. "This is impossible," muttered one of the Korthak students, his voice carrying the kind of professional denial that occurred when expertise encountered something outside its theoretical framework. The AI opponents were demonstrating increasing levels of what could charitably be called tactical confusion. Their advanced behavioral algorithms were designed to respond to conventional military tactics, not to whatever category of engagement this had become. They were being eliminated with efficiency rates that suggested either significant programming errors or the presence of capabilities that hadn't been factored into their threat assessment protocol. Gavantok called out another student, their voice carrying a note of concern that transcended species barriers. "Perhaps we should terminate the simulation." The instructor was staring at his control console with the expression of someone watching his fundamental understanding of reality undergo aggressive revision. Multiple system alerts were cascading across his displays, indicating stress levels in the simulation hardware that approached design limitations. "The chamber systems are operating beyond normal parameters," he announced, his professional calm beginning to show hairline crack. "Equipment stress indicators are entering cautionary ranges." On screen, the human had apparently decided that the simulation's environmental hazards weren't sufficiently hazardous, and had begun modifying them for improved tactical effect. What had been designed as obstacles were being transformed into weapons systems through applications of physics that were technically possible but socially discouraged. The observation deck's occupants watched with the kind of fascination typically reserved for natural disasters or particularly spectacular traffic accidents. The betting pools had been quietly abandoned, since none of the original parameters seemed relevant anymore. The simulation chamber's structural integrity monitors are reporting anomalous readings, Gavantok announced, his voice beginning to carry undertones of concern that transcended academic interest. The human had apparently reached the simulation's final objectives, though her methods had involved approaches that the scenario designers had assumed were physically impossible within the established parameter. She was systematically dismantling the last defensive positions with the kind of methodical precision that suggested this was routine work rather than an academic exercise. "Sir," called out a vexed student, their cybernetic implants flashing urgent warnings. "The simulation's power consumption has exceeded safety protocols. The chamber's cooling systems are approaching overload status." Gavantok's mandibles clicked in rapid patterns that indicated either deep thought or growing panic. The control console was displaying warnings in multiple languages, several of which were specifically reserved for equipment failures that required immediate administrative attention. "Terminate simulation," he commanded, his professional composure finally cracking under the weight of cascading system alerts. Unable to comply, the computer responded with the kind of cheerful efficiency that suggested its programming hadn't anticipated this particular scenario. "Simulation participant is still actively engaged. Safety protocols prevent termination during active combat scenario," which was when everyone realized that the carefully designed educational exercise had transformed into something that would require emergency intervention. Formal incident reports and quite possibly hazard pay for the maintenance staff. The Academy's emergency alert system activated with the kind of urgent efficiency that suggested its designers had anticipated exactly this type of scenario, even if no one could remember when or why. Klaxons began wailing throughout the combat training complex, accompanied by automated announcements in 17 different languages, most of which translated roughly to "please evacuate in an orderly fashion while trying not to panic visibly. All personnel evacuate. Combat Chamber 7 immediately." The announcement system declared with the artificial calm of computers that hadn't been programmed to experience existential dread. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Though we honestly wish it was." Gavantok was frantically cycling through emergency protocols on his control console, his mandibles clicking in patterns that indicated either intense concentration or the early stages of a nervous breakdown. The chamber's power systems were drawing energy at rates that made the Academy's chief financial officer weep with professional anguish, while structural stress monitors reported readings that suggested the laws of physics were filing formal complaint. "Emergency override authorization required," the computer announced. "Please contact your system administrator, assuming they haven't already fled the building." "I am the system administrator," Gavantok roared, his professional composure finally abandoning ship entirely. The observation screens showed the humans still engaged in what could generously be called creative problem-solving, though most military textbooks would classify it as gratuitous reality modification. She had apparently decided that the simulation's final boss encounter wasn't challenging enough, and had begun implementing improvements that the scenario designers had never considered mathematically possible. "Sir," called out a Korthak student, his voice carrying the kind of respectful urgency that indicated imminent disaster, "perhaps we should consider physical evacuation of the chamber itself." "The chamber is designed to be impenetrable during active simulations," Gavantok replied, though his tone suggested he was beginning to question several fundamental assumptions about Academy engineering standards. "Safety protocols prevent external intervention until scenario completion." "And if the scenario never completes?" inquired a Vexstar student, their cybernetic implants calculating probability matrices that were returning results in languages that didn't exist yet. This question hung in the air with the weight of a philosophical inquiry that no one particularly wanted to explore in detail. The simulation systems had been designed with the assumption that all scenarios would eventually reach natural conclusion points, either through student success, student failure, or student unconsciousness. The possibility of indefinite continuation hadn't been factored into the original specifications, mostly because it had seemed theoretically impossible. The Academy's emergency response team arrived with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested they had been expecting this call, even if they weren't entirely sure why. Chief Engineer Yorthak entered the observation area with an expression that indicated his opinion of the situation had already progressed beyond concern and was approaching existential resignation. "Status report," he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades dealing with equipment failures that challenged the fundamental laws of engineering. "Student is engaged in simulation scenario that has exceeded all performance parameters," Gavantok reported, his professional terminology barely concealing what was essentially "everything is broken and we don't know how to fix it." Chief Engineer Yorthak examined the control displays with the expression of a medical professional reviewing X-rays that showed an anatomically impossible injury. Power consumption graphs resembled mountain ranges, structural stress indicators looked like abstract art, and the cooling system monitors were displaying readings that seemed to be written in ancient mathematical languages. "Has anyone considered asking the student to simply stop?" he inquired with the kind of practical wisdom that often eluded academic theorists. The suggestion carried the elegant simplicity of solutions that were either brilliant or completely insane, depending on one's perspective on conventional protocol adherence. Gavantok activated the chamber's communication system, which had been designed for providing tactical updates and encouragement to struggling students. "Attention simulation participant," he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber with electronic distortion that made him sound like a deity with technical difficulties. "Please conclude your current engagement
and proceed to the exit port. The human's voice came back through the communication system with the kind of casual clarity that suggested she was having a perfectly normal conversation while reality restructured itself around her. Almost finished here. Just need to complete the secondary objective. There are no secondary objectives in this scenario, Gavantok replied, his voice carrying the strained patience of someone explaining obvious facts to individuals who seemed determined to ignore them. Found them anyway, came the reply, accompanied by sounds that the audio sensors were having difficulty categorizing, though they seemed to involve controlled explosions and the creative redistribution of simulated architecture. Chief Engineer Yorthak was reviewing system diagnostics with the expression of someone discovering that his house had been built on a foundation of theoretical mathematics. The simulation parameters are being rewritten in real time. She's somehow accessing core programming protocols and implementing modifications that shouldn't be possible without administrator privileges. How is that possible? Demanded Gavantok. It's not, Yorthak replied, which is what makes this particularly concerning from an engineering perspective. The chamber's power consumption had reached levels that required activation of the Academy's emergency generators, while cooling systems were working overtime to prevent what the technical manuals euphemistically referred to as catastrophic thermal event. The simulation hardware was operating in ranges that its warranty specifically excluded, using terminology like acts of student and excessive reality modification. Emergency evacuation of the entire training complex is now authorized, announced the Academy's administrative system, its artificial intelligence apparently having reached the conclusion that discretion was the better part of valor. Students and faculty began flowing out of the building with the kind of organized chaos that indicated excellent emergency preparedness training, combined with absolutely no preparation for this specific type of emergency. The evacuation proceeded smoothly, with one notable exception. Combat Chamber 7 remained sealed, its occupant apparently oblivious to the institutional panic occurring around her. "Sir," called out one of the evacuating students, "shouldn't someone inform the human that the building is being evacuated?" "We tried," Gavantok replied, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose professional expertise had been thoroughly invalidated by recent events. "She said she'd be out in a minute." That had been 17 minutes ago, during which time the Academy's insurance representatives had been making increasingly frantic calls to their head office, while maintenance staff had begun preparing incident reports that would require entirely new categories of equipment failure. Finally, mercifully, the chamber's alert systems fell silent. The power consumption readings dropped to normal levels, the cooling systems began returning to standard operational parameters, and the structural stress monitors reported readings that were merely concerning rather than physically impossible. The chamber door opened with a soft pneumatic hiss, and the human emerged with the same unremarkable demeanor she had maintained throughout her academy enrollment. She appeared entirely unaffected by her experience, as if systematically dismantling what was supposed to be an unwinnable scenario was simply another Tuesday afternoon activity. "Interesting exercise," she commented to Gavantok, who was staring at her with the expression of someone whose worldview had been professionally deconstructed. "The AI opponents showed good adaptability once I started modifying the environmental parameters." "You modified the environmental parameters?" he asked weakly. "The scenario seemed a bit straightforward," she replied with a shrug that suggested casual indifference to having just rewritten several fundamental assumptions about combat simulation technology. "So I made some adjustments to keep things interesting." The post-incident investigation would eventually reveal that the human student had somehow accessed administrative functions that required security clearances she didn't possess, implemented tactical modifications that violated physics in several interesting ways, and completed objectives that hadn't existed until she created them. Her military background, which had been noted in her application file but apparently overlooked during assessment placement, included specialized training in environments that made the Academy's most advanced scenarios look like recreational activity. The Academy's new assessment protocols, implemented 3 weeks later, included mandatory detailed review of all human applicants' military experience, regardless of how basic it appeared on paper. The betting pools for human student performance were permanently discontinued after several species lost significant amounts of currency by underestimating what routine peacekeeping operations meant in human military terminology. Daventok himself received a commendation for maintaining professional composure during unprecedented equipment stress scenarios, though those who had witnessed the events noted that his mandible still clicked nervously whenever human students entered his classroom. The human student, for her part, was quietly transferred to advanced tactical courses typically reserved for final-year students from apex predator species. She accepted this adjustment with the same unremarkable demeanor she had maintained throughout the entire incident, as if having one's academic placement completely revised, due to accidentally breaking an entire simulation chamber, was simply another routine administrative matter. The Academy's recruitment materials were subsequently updated to include a disclaimer noting that human military experience should be evaluated using species-specific criteria, since their definition of basic training appeared to encompass skill sets that other species classified as advanced special operations. The legal department had insisted on this addition after reviewing the insurance claims and deciding that prevention was significantly more cost-effective than replacement. And in the end, the Galactic Combat Academy learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of assumption, the importance of thorough background checks, and the surprisingly high cost of underestimating a species that had somehow managed to turn routine educational exercises into infrastructure emergency. Though they still weren't entirely sure how she had managed to modify a sealed simulation system from the inside, which remained a mystery that made the engineering department wake up in cold sweats and contemplate career changes in less stressful fields, like bomb disposal or volcano monitoring.